The piercing wail of alarms ripped through the crisp morning air of Erebus V, shattering the usual calm of the remote mining colony. Commander Elias Cade bolted upright from his station, his eyes immediately darting to the monitors on the wall. Red warning indicators blinked across every display, and a familiar, dreaded symbol appeared on the radar: Scouser warships. "Commander, we've lost contact with the North Mining Convoy," a young officer stammered from across the command room. "Their signal just disappeared." Cade's jaw tightened. He leaned over the console, his mind racing. The Scouser had been quiet for nearly a year. Too quiet. The ceasefire, fragile as it was, had held until now. "They've broken the treaty," he said, his voice low but sharp. The officer hesitated. "Are you sure, sir? Maybe it's a—" "Don't kid yourself," Cade interrupted, his tone cutting through the room like a blade. "No one else in this sector has the firepower to wipe out a convoy in seconds. Sound the alarm colony-wide. I want every available person in the bunkers or armed." "Yes, Commander." Cade turned to the comms panel and patched through to the planetary governor. The grainy image of Governor Alvarez appeared on the screen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked without preamble. "They've taken the convoy and are moving toward the main colony. We have hours at best," Cade said, his tone steady despite the chaos in his mind. "We need to activate the defense protocols immediately. This isn't a skirmish, it's a full-scale invasion." Alvarez nodded grimly. "The Scouser always come for what they can have. What's the plan?" Cade's eyes flicked to the tactical display. "We don't have the numbers to fight them head-on, but we can slow them down. I'll take charge of the defense grid and buy us time. Reinforcements from the Terran fleet are weeks away. If we're going to survive, we need every civilian armed and ready." Alvarez hesitated. "These are miners and engineers, not soldiers, Cade. They'll die as miners or live as fighters." Cade snapped. "You choose." The line went dead as Alvarez closed the connection. Cade didn't wait. He turned to his team. "Send out a colony-wide broadcast," he ordered. "Tell them we're under attack. I want the perimeter cannons online and operational in the next 10 minutes. No excuses. If someone's not working, they're dead weight." The officers scattered, barking orders into their headsets. Outside, the landscape of Erebus V stretched into a barren expanse of jagged rocks and endless dust storms. The colony itself was a patchwork of prefabricated structures, mining rigs, and scattered housing units. It wasn't much, but to the people who called it home, it was everything. The Scouser attack came swiftly. Their ships broke through the atmosphere like black daggers, sleek and menacing. The first to land unleashed squads of hulking reptilian soldiers clad in armor that shimmered with an oily sheen. They wasted no time, tearing through the northern perimeter and taking control of one of the colony's largest resource depots. "Commander, the north sector's gone," a voice crackled through Cade's earpiece. "Pull everyone back to the central hub," Cade replied. "Do not engage unless necessary. We're not winning this by brute force." The Scouser weren't just invaders, they were predators. Cade had fought them before and knew their tactics. They relished overwhelming their opponents with fear and brute strength. But they underestimated humanity's resilience, every time. Cade stood at the colony's command center, overlooking the chaos through the reinforced glass windows. A group of terrified miners huddled near the central plaza as volunteers handed out weapons, mostly improvised, ranging from plasma cutters to modified mining tools. "Listen up!" Cade barked as he stepped into the plaza. His voice silenced the murmurs and cries of fear. "I know most of you didn't sign up for this. You came here to dig, not fight. But today you fight. Because if you don't, they'll take everything, and everyone, you care about." A young man, barely out of his teens, raised his hand. "How are we supposed to fight them? They've got ships and weapons we've never seen before." Cade stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "They're stronger, yes. Better armed, sure. But they're not smarter. We know this colony better than they ever will. Every tunnel, every choke point, it's ours. And that's how we're going to win." By outthinking them. The young man nodded reluctantly, his fear giving way to determination. Good. Now spread out and take your positions, Cade ordered. The first skirmish came at dusk. Skalzar infantry units advanced on the southern edge of the colony, their heavy boots shaking the ground. Cade watched from a concealed vantage point as his team activated the first of many traps, a series of mining explosives rigged to detonate when the enemy crossed a specific threshold. The explosion was deafening, sending a plume of dust and debris into the air. Several Skalzar soldiers were thrown backward, their thick armor cracked and scorched. Direct hit, one of Cade's officers reported. Don't celebrate yet, Cade replied. They'll adapt. They always do. And adapt they did. The Skalzar pulled back momentarily, only to return with heavier artillery. Their weapons tore through the colony's outer defenses like paper, forcing Cade and his team to retreat further into the central hub. By nightfall, the situation was dire. Cade stood in the dimly lit command center, staring at the tactical map. The Skalzar had seized 2 more sectors and were closing in on the colony's main power grid. We're running out of time, said Lieutenant Harper, Cade's second-in-command. I know, Cade replied, his voice heavy. But we're not beaten yet. He turned to his team. Get me a direct line to Governor Alvarez. We need to evacuate the civilians to the underground tunnels. If we can hold the Skalzar here long enough, we might have a chance. What about the reinforcements? Harper asked. Cade shook his head. They're too far out. This is on us. As the Skalzar forces began their final push toward the colony's core, Cade made his way to the front lines. He moved through the ranks of exhausted miners and soldiers, offering words of encouragement and last-minute instructions. We've got one shot at this, he told them. If we can't stop them here, we lose everything. But if we hold the line, if we make them bleed, they'll think twice before ever coming back. The defenders nodded, their fear giving way to resolve. The chapter ends with the Skalzar's main assault beginning. Explosions light up the night as Cade's traps and defenses spring into action. The air is thick with smoke and the sound of battle, but amidst the chaos, Cade stands firm, his mind already working on the next move. The final line. If they wanted a war, they just declared it against the wrong species. The faint hum of the colony's emergency lights barely masked the distant rumble of Skalzar artillery. Commander Elias Cade stood in the underground operations room, his face illuminated by the glow of the tactical map. The colony's defenses were barely holding, and the Skalzar forces were tightening their grip. Status report, Cade demanded, his voice sharp but steady. Lieutenant Harper leaned over the map. The northern barricade collapsed an hour ago. We've got civilians pulling back to the central tunnels, but Skalzar drones are patrolling the outskirts. They're hunting anyone left behind. Cade's brow furrowed as he studied the map. The Skalzar were relentless, and their tactics, while brutal, were calculated. But there was one thing they weren't prepared for: desperation. Humans had a way of fighting best when their backs were against the wall. Harper, get the engineers working on that decoy rig in Sector 12. If we can lure their ground units into the old mining tunnels, we can collapse the entrance and bury them alive, Cade said. That's a long shot, Commander, Harper replied, his tone cautious. Those tunnels are unstable, and we might lose people in the process. We've already lost people, Cade shot back, his voice steel. We don't win this by playing it safe. We win this by making them bleed for every inch they take. Above ground, the air was thick with smoke and ash. Fires burned in the distance where the Skalzar artillery had reduced entire sectors of the colony to rubble. A group of miners-turned-fighters crouched behind a row of overturned supply carts, clutching makeshift weapons. Cade approached them, his presence commanding. Listen up, he said, his voice low but firm. I know you're scared. Hell, I'd be worried if you weren't. But fear doesn't win wars. Strategy does. And right now, we've got the advantage. A burly miner with soot-streaked cheeks spoke up. Advantage? They've got tanks. We've got drills and plasma cutters. Cade smirked. And we've got the terrain. They're fighting blind on our turf. They don't know these rocks, these tunnels, like you do. Every step they take, they're stepping into a trap we set. The miner exchanged a glance with his comrades before nodding. What's the plan, Commander? Ambush. We bait their patrols into the central ravine. Once they're in, we hit them from all sides. No mercy. Hours later, the ambush was in full swing. Scalzar patrols marched through the jagged ravine, their armor glinting under the colony's emergency floodlights. They moved with precision, scanning every shadow for movement. But Cade's fighters were patient, hidden among the rocks, waiting for the perfect moment. Hold! Cade whispered into his comm, watching the patrol from his perch above the ravine. His heart pounded, but his focus was razor-sharp. The Scalzar commander barked something in their guttural language, and the patrol began to spread out. Cade raised his hand, signaling his team. Now! He shouted. Explosions erupted from the walls of the ravine as hidden charges detonated, raining debris onto the Scalzar troops. The miners emerged from their hiding spots, attacking with a ferocity born of desperation. Plasma cutters slashed through alien armor, and modified drills drove into weak points. Cade leapt down from his perch, his plasma rifle firing in controlled bursts. A Scalzar soldier lunged at him, its blades slicing through the air, but Cade sidestepped and delivered a precise shot to its exposed neck. The alien collapsed with a guttural roar. Keep pushing! Cade yelled, rallying his fighters. Don't let them regroup! The battle was chaotic and brutal. For every Scalzar soldier they took down, another seemed to emerge from the smoke. But the humans fought with a tenacity that the aliens hadn't anticipated. By the time the dust settled, the ravine was littered with Scalzar bodies, and the surviving humans retreated into the tunnels before reinforcements could arrive. Back at the central hub, the mood was grim but determined. The victory in the ravine had come at a cost. Several fighters hadn't made it back. Cade stood in the makeshift infirmary, watching as medics tended to the wounded. A young woman, her arm wrapped in a crude sling, looked up at him. Did we do it? She asked, her voice trembling. Did we stop them? For now, Cade replied. But this is just the beginning. Harper entered the room, his expression somber. Commander, we intercepted some of their comms. Vraxis knows what we're doing. He's doubling down. Cade nodded, unsurprised. Let him. The more resources he throws at us, the more we can hurt him. But Commander, Harper said hesitantly, we can't keep this up forever. Our supplies are running low, and the people, they're at their breaking point. Cade's gaze hardened. We don't need forever. We just need enough time to make him regret ever setting foot on this planet. That night, Cade gathered his remaining fighters in the command center. The room was crowded, the air heavy with tension and exhaustion. Cade stood at the front, his presence commanding attention. Today, we showed them what humanity is made of, he began, his voice steady. They thought they could break us with fear, with overwhelming force. But we stood our ground. And we made them pay. He paused, letting his words sink in. But this fight isn't over. Not by a long shot. Vraxis is coming for us with everything he's got. And when he does, we'll be ready. Because we're not just fighting for this colony, we're fighting for every human out there who's counting on us. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The miners and engineers, battered and bloodied, straightened their shoulders. Cade had given them hope, and that was a weapon even the Scalzar couldn't match. Meanwhile, in the Scalzar command ship orbiting the planet, Overlord Vraxis seethed with frustration. His claws dug into the metal armrest of his throne as he watched the hollow feed of the ravine ambush. These humans are proving troublesome, his second-in-command said cautiously. They are insects, Vraxis growled, his voice a low rumble. Insects that dare bite back. But insects can be crushed. He rose from his throne, his towering form casting a shadow over the room. Deploy the harvesters. I want every inch of that colony stripped bare. And when the humans crawl out of their holes to stop us, we will annihilate them. The next morning, Cade and his team prepared for the Scalzar's counterattack. They worked tirelessly, reinforcing barricades, setting traps, and rationing what little supplies they had left. The colony had become a fortress, every corner a potential battleground. As Cade surveyed their preparations, Harper approached him. "Do you think we can hold them off?" Cade didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out at the horizon, where the first Scalzar ships were beginning to descend. "We don't have a choice," he finally said. "If we fall here, they won't stop. They'll take every colony, every planet, until there's nothing left." Harper nodded, his expression grim. "Then we make our stand." Cade's gaze hardened as he watched the Scalzar forces gather. The odds were stacked against them, but he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. "Let them come," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We'll show them what happens when you declare war on humanity." The air was unnervingly still as the Scalzar army began their advance on the central colony. From his vantage point on the command center's roof, Commander Elias Cade surveyed the horizon, his sharp eyes tracking the ominous wave of armored figures and shimmering war machines. The Scalzar had brought their full force: hover tanks, combat drones, and legions of reptilian soldiers, each one prepared to grind the colony into dust. "Commander, they're almost within range." Lieutenant Harper's voice crackled through Cade's calm. "Hold your fire," Cade replied, his tone steady despite the pressure mounting on his shoulders. "We need them to commit before we spring the trap." He glanced down at the square below, where a small group of fighters stood ready, their faces lined with exhaustion but hardened with determination. Makeshift barricades formed a perimeter around the colony's power core, the last stronghold of Erebus V. To the Scalzar, it was the colony's heart, and their ultimate prize. Cade's calm buzzed again. "Sir, they're deploying harvesters," Harper reported. "They'll tear through our supply caches in minutes." "Let them," Cade said. "They're walking right into our hands." The Scalzar's advance was precise, methodical. Hover tanks carved a path through the colony's outer defenses, while drones swept ahead, scanning for resistance. Overlord Vraxis observed from the safety of his command pod, his lips curling into a cruel smile. To him, this was already a victory. The humans had resisted admirably, but their efforts were a mere nuisance, a flickering candle in the face of a storm. "Commander Vraxis growled to his second-in-command. "Push the infantry forward. I want this over quickly." "As you command, Overlord," Brock replied, bowing his massive head. The Scalzar infantry surged forward, their heavy boots pounding the ground in unison. They approached the colony square, their weapons at the ready, when the first explosion tore through their ranks. A series of underground charges detonated in sequence, sending debris and alien soldiers flying into the air. Cade's voice rang out over the colony's speakers. "Welcome to Erebus V, you scaly bastards! Hope you enjoy the fireworks." From hidden vantage points, human fighters opened fire. Plasma bolts rained down on the disoriented Scalzar, their confusion compounded by the sudden barrage. The colony had become a maze of death traps, every corner rigged with explosives, concealed turrets, or ambush points. On the ground, Cade moved with purpose, his rifle slung across his back as he coordinated the defense. He ducked behind a barricade where Harper and a small group of fighters were holding the line. "How are we looking?" Cade asked. "Better than expected," Harper replied, firing off a shot that struck a Scalzar drone. "But they're adapting. Their infantry is pushing through the west flank, and their tanks are bypassing the traps." Cade nodded grimly. "We'll slow them down. Get me a comm line to Alvarez." Moments later, Governor Alvarez's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Cade, we're down to our last reserves. If this doesn't work..." "It'll work," Cade interrupted. "Just keep the evac routes clear. We need to buy enough time for the civilians to reach the fallback tunnels." "And what about you?" Alvarez asked. Cade's silence spoke volumes. As the Scalzar regrouped, Vraxis grew impatient. He rose from his command pod, his hulking form towering over his subordinates. "Enough of this," he snarled. "Deploy the shock squads. Crush them." Elite Scalzar warriors descended onto the battlefield, their armor gleaming with energy shields. They moved with terrifying precision, cutting through human defenses with ease. Cade watched from the command center, his fists clenching. "Harper, pull everyone back to the core," Cade ordered. "We make our stand there." The final battle for Erebus V unfolded in the shadow of the colony's power core. The remaining fighters dug in, their faces grim but resolute. Cade stood at the forefront, his rifle raised. He knew this was their last chance. If they couldn't hold the line here, there would be no colony left to defend. The Scouser shock squad stormed the square, their energy shields deflecting plasma bolts. Cade barked orders, directing his fighters to focus their fire on weak points in the shields. One by one, the elite warriors began to fall, but the cost was high. Human fighters dropped alongside them, their cries echoing in the chaos. "Cade, we can't hold much longer!" Harper shouted over the din. Cade's mind raced. He glanced at the power core, its hum growing louder as the overload sequence he'd initiated began to reach its peak. It was a gamble, but it was their only chance. "Harper, get the civilians out now!" Cade yelled. "This place is going to blow." "What about you?" Harper demanded. "I'll catch up," Cade lied. As the last civilians disappeared into the tunnels, Cade turned his attention back to the battle. He and a handful of fighters held the line, their weapons blazing as the Scalzar forces closed in. Vraxis himself stepped onto the battlefield, his massive frame dwarfing the humans around him. "You fought well, human," Vraxis said, his voice dripping with disdain. "But your resistance ends here." Cade met the Overlord's gaze, his expression defiant. "You think you've won? Look around. You're standing on a graveyard, and it's about to get a lot more crowded." With that, Cade triggered the final sequence. The power core erupted in a blinding explosion, its energy tearing through the square. The shockwave obliterated the Scalzar forces, their screams drowned out by the roar of the blast. Hours later, the Terran fleet arrived to find a colony in ruins but not defeated. Survivors emerged from the tunnels, battered but alive. Among them was Harper, carrying a bloody but conscious Cade on his shoulder. "You did it, Commander," Harper said, his voice thick with emotion. Cade managed a weak smile. "We all did." As the fleet began evacuation efforts, Cade looked back at the smoking remains of Erebus V. The colony had been saved, but the price had been steep. Still, one thing was clear: humanity had sent a message to the galaxy. They were not to be underestimated. And if the Scalzar ever tried again, they'd be ready. The silence after the battle was deafening. The once bustling colony of Erebus V was now a smoldering wasteland, its buildings reduced to rubble and its air thick with ash. Survivors huddled in the underground tunnels, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Commander Elias Cade sat slumped against the wall of the makeshift infirmary, a bandage wrapped tightly around his arm and a datapad in his lap. The reports were grim. Nearly half the colony's population had been lost, and supplies were critically low. But despite the devastation, they had done the unthinkable. They had driven the Scalzar back. "Commander," Lieutenant Harper's voice broke the silence as he entered the room. "Governor Alvarez wants to see you in the command bunker." Cade nodded, wincing as he pushed himself to his feet. Every muscle in his body ached, but there was no time to rest. The fight wasn't over yet. The command bunker was a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Screens flickered with tactical data, and the hum of machinery filled the air. Governor Alvarez stood at the center, her arms crossed and her expression grim. She turned as Cade entered. "Elias," she said, her tone softer than usual. "We just received an intercepted transmission from the Scalzar fleet." Cade raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, they're regrouping." "Worse," Alvarez replied. She tapped a button on the console, and the garbled voice of Overlord Vraxis filled the room. "This is not over," the message snarled. "You may have won the battle, but humanity will burn. Prepare yourselves for annihilation." Cade's jaw tightened as the transmission ended. He had expected retaliation, but hearing Vraxis's fury confirmed his worst fears. The Scalzar weren't just licking their wounds, they were planning their revenge. "We can't wait for them to strike first," Cade said, his voice firm. We need to take the fight to them. Alvarez frowned. With what? We've barely got enough resources to keep the survivors alive, let alone launch an offensive. Cade turned to Harper, who was studying a map of the surrounding systems. What's the status of the old mining freighters? Can any of them be retrofitted for combat? Harper hesitated. They're old and barely space-worthy, but it's possible. We need to scavenge parts from the wreckage outside, and it won't be pretty. It doesn't have to be pretty, Cade said. It just has to work. For the next several days, the survivors of Erebus V threw themselves into the monumental task of preparing for an offensive. Engineers worked around the clock to arm the mining freighters, turning them into crude but functional warships. Mechanics scavenged weapons from fallen Skalzar soldiers, modifying them for human use. Even the civilians who couldn't fight found ways to contribute, whether by repairing equipment, distributing rations, or caring for the wounded. In the center of it all was Cade, directing every effort with unrelenting focus. Despite his injuries, he refused to rest, spending long hours in the hangars and on the battlefield, ensuring every detail was accounted for. As the makeshift fleet began to take shape, Harper approached Cade in the dimly lit hangar. "Commander, you need to take a break," he said, his voice tinged with concern. "You're running on fumes." "I'll rest when this is over," Cade replied, his gaze fixed on a schematic for one of the freighters. "We've only got one shot at this, Harper. If we screw it up, there won't be anything left to fight for." Harper sighed. "You always say that, but it's not just about the mission. The people here look up to you. If you burn out, what happens to them?" Cade paused, the weight of Harper's words sinking in. He set down the datapad and turned to his lieutenant. "I'm not doing this for me, Harper. I'm doing it for them, for everyone we lost and everyone who's still standing. They deserve a fighting chance. And they'll have it," Harper said. "But only if we're smart about this." The day of the offensive arrived. The retrofitted freighters, now bristling with makeshift weapons, sat ready on the landing pads. Cade stood before the gathered fighters, his voice steady as he addressed them. "Most of you weren't soldiers when this started," he began. "You were miners, engineers, farmers. But you've proven that you're more than that. You're fighters. Survivors. And today, you're going to show the Skalzar what humanity is made of." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This isn't just about Erebus V. It's about every colony, every planet, every person who calls humanity their own. The Skalzar think they can break us, but they don't understand what we're capable of. So let's show them." A cheer erupted from the crowd, and Cade felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Despite everything they had endured, they were ready to fight. The fleet launched into the dark expanse of space, their engines roaring as they ascended through the atmosphere. Cade sat in the cockpit of the lead freighter, his hands steady on the controls. Beside him, Harper monitored the tactical display. "Enemy ships detected," Harper reported. "Looks like they've set up a blockade just outside the system." "Perfect," Cade said. "Let's give them a warm welcome." The freighters charged forward, their weapons firing in synchronized bursts. The Skalzar ships, though more advanced, were caught off guard by the humans' unexpected aggression. Explosions lit up the void as the crude human weapons found their marks, tearing through enemy hulls. Cade's voice crackled over the comms. "Focus fire on their flagship. Take out Vraxis, and the rest will scatter." The battle was brutal and chaotic. The Skalzar retaliated with overwhelming force, their ships unleashing volleys of plasma that rocked the human freighters. But Cade and his fighters refused to back down, using their smaller, more agile ships to outmaneuver the enemy. As the freighters closed in on the Skalzar flagship, Cade's ship took a direct hit, sending sparks flying across the cockpit. "Shields are failing!" Harper shouted. "Then we make it count," Cade replied, steering the freighter straight toward the flagship. The final moments of the battle were a blur. Cade's freighter collided with the flagship in a fiery explosion, breaching its hull and sending shockwaves through the enemy fleet. As the Skalzar ships began to retreat, the remaining human fighters cheered in triumph. Back on Erebus V, the survivors gathered in the colony square, their faces alight with relief and pride. Cade, battered but alive, stood at the center, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We did what they said was impossible," he said. "We stood our ground, and we took the fight to them. And we won. Not because we had better weapons or stronger ships, but because we had something they didn't, the will to survive." The crowd erupted into cheers, and for the first time in weeks, the colony felt a glimmer of hope. The fight wasn't over, but they had proven that humanity was not to be underestimated. As Cade looked out at the faces of his people, he felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. They had endured hell, but they had come out stronger. And as long as they stood together, there was nothing they couldn't overcome.